I'm Matt Housley, and you're listening to It's About Data, Episode 3. This time, Tony Bear and I are discussing Google Cloud Next 2025. So, Tony, welcome. Today's topic basically comes down to your travels recently. Why don't you tell us a bit about the top level of the travels, and then we'll get into some topics.
Oh, gosh. When have I not been traveling lately? But the last part was to Vegas. What happened in Vegas, in this case, is not going to stay in Vegas. So we're going to.
It's not all of it.
Yeah, we're going to spill the beans here. We're
Yes.
talking about Google Next 2025 and the preview of the reimagined The Wizard of Oz in the Sphere. I mean, that was literally huge.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you want to dive right into that? We can talk about some of the details, or
We'll put it this way. That's the obvious headline. Obviously, it's not the thing that enterprises are going to be going for. But the thing is, I think it was meant to make a statement that for the last few years, the conventional wisdom was, well, Google really was a pioneer using AI, but they kind of let OpenAI steal a lot of its thunder. Yeah. And I think this year, this is very much their statement of like, we've always been there. And the thing is, and more to the point, is that we've been a lot more, we've taken more of an enterprise focus. So maybe we're not being the first out with a new service, but that, when we come out with it, it's generally well thought out. Now, of course, that script has not been perfect. I know there have been, there have been some, some glitches, with some of the Gemini introductions. But in general, I think we've seen very much that Google is not necessarily trying to jump to the automatically bigger is better and you better come with us. It's more like we're thinking about the enterprise.
Very much so. And one of the interesting stories at Google, actually you go to the low-key data happy hour in New York once in a while. I'll introduce you to someone there who works at Google who basically told me, we had chatbots. We had something just like ChatGPT internally at Google, and the public didn't know about it. And we were using it not just as a toy, but he was in product and data. He said, you'd ask it questions and it would help you to solve product problems and such. And so it just took them a long time to get up to speed on the enterprise story. But now that they're getting up to speed, they're extremely well positioned to take advantage of that. I mean, they have their own cloud. They have a lot of very mature enterprise services, even though they're not as big as AWS. In the infrastructure as a service space, for example, they're still actually really big in that space. And so there is a huge opportunity for them here to catch up. And it sounds like that's what's happening. And that was the general sentiment at Next this year.
Right. I mean, that's definitely the influence of Tom Curran. When Google, obviously it's been an evolution. You had Diane Green initially, who was kind of like the enterprise whisperer, but it basically took Tom Curran to really bring in basically enterprise people and to really change the mindset at Google Cloud.
Yeah. And I have to say, you, in our notes, you talked a lot about agentic features and AI specific features, but also there were a whole lot of BigQuery announcements that are more, conventional, traditional data warehousing, but very, very impressive stuff happening.
Yeah. Let me go through what I'd say, but we really, I'll start at the top and we can kind of dive down. But I really saw like four really key themes that came out of it. I mean, the obvious one, it was kind of hard to avoid this, was agents. And I've always felt very sort of, a little nervous about agents because, we still don't really fully understand the unknowns of Gen AI, and now we're putting in all these autonomous pieces to it.
Yeah.
But I actually saw some fairly interesting, what I liked was, what I saw at Next was really focus on some of the foundations, on some of the basics. And this doesn't mean that we've gotten this problem solved, okay? But there are a lot of interesting things. For one thing, we'll just start, at the building blocks level. Google added its name to a growing. It's jumped on the bandwagon of Model Context Protocol (MCP). Now, Google did not originate that, but when I saw this back last fall, I thought this is potentially huge. How do models talk to data? This is critical. You can't be inventing this every time. But and so Google is definitely very much signed on to that. But the other part of all this is that they've introduced, a new open standard, and they've gotten a lot of interesting early backing, which is the agent-to-agent protocol, because it's really the corollary. I don't see, I've seen some LinkedIn posts where we talk about MCP versus agent-to-agent, and they're not competitive. They complement each other. It's like one is how do you talk to data, and two is how do agents talk to each other. And they've gotten so impressive early response. I mean, Google only announced it in the last week, but already they've got Atlassian, SAP. I'm just reading some of the names off the list. Yeah. Salesforce, ServiceNow, MongoDB, Workday, and a bunch of others. So it's an impressive start. Obviously, it's not everybody there. We don't see AWS yet or anything like that. But this is a good start. And the thing is, does anybody have anything else that's equally compelling out there? And the fact is, I don't see this as an area. It's kind of like open table formats. Vendors are not going to differentiate based on their agent-to-agent protocol. We all have to get them to talk to each other. So I think that was interesting. Of course, Google talked a lot about agent space, which they released actually about, not quite 6 months ago. It was back in December, I believe. So that was not new, but here it really came into the limelight, which is kind of like an enterprise canvas, for agents. And with it, they came out with some fit for purpose agents, for agent space, which is kind of like, as I said, a canvas and a portal. Came out with an agent that helps you do for deep research, and another one for idea generation. And they did a few for BigQuery, which we'll go into in a moment. So I thought this was very interesting in terms of focusing on some basics. I still have a lot of hesitations, though, with agents in the long run in terms of, because when I looked at demos out on the floor, I said, do you have any way to basically track and version control? And I didn't really see any of that yet. Yeah. And if we don't watch out, this could be the new spaghetti code.
I mean, it kind of already is, right? This is a notorious problem with all of these chat APIs where you make calls to large language models. Like OpenAI will silently change the model version constantly, actually, without telling you. And so my question is, at some point, Google, with its more of its enterprise focus, plus its very heavy operational focus, frankly, are they going to introduce like true versioning of models so you can get a more reliable experience if you're developing an application around AI? And it doesn't sound like they introduced that yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did at some point.
I mean, we're seeing in terms of versioning of models, say in Vertex AI. So it's basically, and look, Rome was not built in a day. I wouldn't expect that they would have versioning or some sort of CI/CD or some sort of Git for this. I've got to believe that that's got to be happening, whether it comes from Google or someone else or whatever. Yes. But I mean, I think the industry, we're going to see, I definitely expect to see some movement from the industry the rest of the year. Another thing, as I said, that whole initial, I just want to go back a little bit into the spectacle of the sphere before we get into data, which is that it was interesting in terms of that the sphere, which is basically now part of the Madison Square Garden organization that's based here in New York, and Jim Dolan, who's quite a character. They actually basically competed this amongst they had about a half dozen on their list and then about 4 on their short list, and they ultimately selected Google. They did not disclose who the others were, but you could probably guess. But I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that Google does have a very much of an enterprise focus. But the other interesting thing, this has nothing to do with anything else except that sometimes the most irrelevant things are the things that make things happen, is seeing basically kind of a real sort of a meeting of the minds between James Dolan and Tom Curry. And I would have never put those two together on the same stage. Because Jim Dolan in New York is known as quite a character and not always in the most complimentary terms.
Well, and Tom Curran he's frankly Oracle through and through, or he was before he came to Google Cloud. Now he's Google through and through, but he's like that very buttoned down, kind of legalistic, but very sales-oriented culture that comes from.
Yeah, very, very much so. So it was really funny. So I think that was probably a key part of the deal. Yeah. I'm sure that basically that given that that Dolan runs a very tight ship there, and it's very much what and it's very top down. That probably a key part of it was who did he feel comfortable being his partner, and that was quite interesting. One other thing just about the AI that was involved with it, because I think that was interesting. Now the Sphere itself is about 1,800 times bigger than the biggest IMAX screen in the world.
And
Okay.
it's 16K resolution, they say. I mean, I don't know if it's not truly square, right? But they say it's approximately 16K resolution
Yeah.
versus 4K for, typical ultra high definition.
Right, right. And they gave us a whole demo there. But anyway, what was interesting with reimagining, because this is not a matter of basically digitizing an old analog film.
Yes. Very different.
Because that would be a matter of, okay, we're going to basically use some digital technology and sharpen the pixels. This was a lot more than that, and really shows basically a lot of the issues that generative AI needs to deal with, which is that it's not just a matter of like filling in the missing pixels, but when you're projecting on a whole different format like that, you have to build literally a bigger scene. So in other words, like where characters may be off camera, you now have to figure out which characters were involved in the scene and put them on camera and figure out what their roles were and how they would be responding. The other thing is also is that part of this is that they're going to do a lot more in the way of full head to toe shots of Dorothy. Well, guess what? Those red shoes.
Shoes.
In the original film, there were only 8 frames that showed her shoes. How do you build a model off of that? And they evidently did. And the thing is, I have seen presentations in the past, not with generative, on how you can basically build and train models on small data sets. And the thing is, that's actually, I think the reason why this is really relevant to our discussion is that I think this is going to has a lot of implications for in the future in terms of the training of generative models and how we can get this stuff down to size. It's a little more that we can deal with in this discussion here. But I thought for that reason it was just kind of interesting to bring it up. I just want to kind of finally go into basically my own my own area here. Get a little parochial here, which is BigQuery.
Also mine, frankly, like one of my favorite tools for data in general.
I mean, remember, this podcast it's about data.
It's about data. Here we are.
And they've done some interesting things. Number one, obviously, there has been Gemini in BigQuery. They've expanded it now that basically deals with a lot. There are a lot more of services, from data exploration that you can do with Gemini. But the other thing is also, and this is part of Google's basically positioning with Gemini and AI, is that they're really going very heavy into what we call multimodal models. Mm-hmm. Not just LLMs, but this could be large image models, large video models, audio, image. Basically, they have a number of models for So they certainly announced the latest versions of Lyria and Veo and all those. But what's interesting with BigQuery is that they're doing previewing of support for multimodal tables. And I think there are potentially a lot of interesting capabilities there in terms of how you extract data from multimodal data. And that's something which we need to have some more discussions with the Google folks on, but I think there's a lot. Yeah. There's going to be a lot to plumb there. The other thing also is that their support for Iceberg is now going into general availability, into GA. And it will basically, and I think as we're seeing with a lot of the Iceberg implementations, is that every vendor will differentiate based on what's the home experience with their platform. And I think here you'll see Google bring a lot of the multimodal basically capabilities into their managed Iceberg, their native implementation of Iceberg.
Well, and I have to say what impressed me, and this overlaps a lot with what you're saying, but as I was reading the Next announcements, is that Google is pushing interop of BigQuery really hard. And so it kind of goes back to what you were saying about open standards. They now have BigQuery Spark is native, so you can run Spark right inside of BigQuery itself, inside of the cluster. It's very ephemeral cluster. That's a whole other topic. And this is interesting because this has kind of been an Achilles heel for Snowflake, frankly.
Yes.
They introduced some time ago something called Snowpark, and it's actually kind of a play on Spark, but it's not Spark and it's not compatible with Spark. And frankly, in my circle, it was universally panned. People just said, this is horrible. We want Spark. I've also heard stories. One of my friends applied to give a talk at Snowflake Summit on something Spark related, and it was rejected. So it's interesting to see Google really pushing hard on the open source. And I kind of think that under Sridhar Ramaswamy, we're going to see the same thing from Snowflake eventually, because I think this is where we're going. There's always this balance, right?
Yeah.
Like keeping people in the ecosystem, but letting them interop enough so that you get more customers. You don't lose customers to more open platforms.
Yeah, no question about that. I think with Google, it's that it's more, I wouldn't call it the enemy of the enemy, is that Google's not treating anybody as enemies at this point.
Right, right.
I mean, they'll be happy to play friendly with everyone, of course. It's more from the standpoint of, are they getting respect from everyone? Are they getting respect from the Snowflakes of the world, and the Databrickses? Because for those platforms, I mean, obviously, it's Google's big challenge is that even though, of course, I mean, it's kind of a rising tide is lifting all boats at this point. And I have to say, at this point, given bigger things that are happening that are beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but still, when you talk to Databricks or Snowflake, yes, they are in all three hyperscalers, but Google is their smallest installed base, and so it's probably somewhat not so much a matter of getting a rise out of those folks. It's that. It's that they did get the respect out of those folks, and that's basically. But on the other hand, in terms of what Google is doing with AI, I think that's definitely it's a clear way of getting the attention, because essentially they're clearly more pro. I mean, even though AWS doth protesteth that it's now getting that it's waking up with AI, the fact is they're really in respond mode. Microsoft up until now is largely kind of outsourced this to OpenAI. I think they're now starting to but it takes a while. Google's been out there, and the thing is, what I always critique Google for before this is that you guys invented transformers. When ChatGPT came out, why didn't you guys say, hey, we invented the technology that made ChatGPT possible? And Google was just really weirdly quiet about all this. But I think at this point, they're now, without having to fight old battles, I think at this point, they're probably trying to say, like, we're here, and we're the one that's been doing this all along, and we're here now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk a bit about some of the history of BigQuery. And I think you probably have a perspective on this because you've been covering them and Snowflake and Redshift, all these products from the enterprise side for a while.
Yeah.
And that is, over the years, not so much in the last 2 years, but I did a number of Snowflake installs, BigQuery installs, and some Redshift installs. And to be quite frank, the BigQuery was the best of the three by far. Not just faster, but like easier to use for customers, easier to use for us. But they were also the worst from the sales perspective. And it kind of came down to two things. So one of those was that they were not multi-cloud, Snowflake's multi-cloud, and specifically they were not on AWS. So you're missing out on the biggest platform, huge platform for cloud, still is the dominant one for infrastructure from my perspective. And second was that Google had so many good products on Google Cloud that there wasn't really a sales focus on BigQuery, right? It was like Snowflake is all data, whereas Google Cloud was selling all these different services, and there was just never that much focus. And so now I think we're seeing that shift where BigQuery Omni, their multi-cloud product where you can run on AWS, is really maturing. That's exciting. And there seems to be more of a story around BigQuery emerging. So I'm going to be curious to see how the story evolves. Yes. And also I'm going to be curious to see if they can really do the sales focus on their AI products instead of just treating them as like part of a bigger solution where they're not really calling them out and saying, you really need to focus on this as a customer, not just the GCP platform in general.
I think we'll come back to that one in about 6 months.
Yes, or sooner. Who knows what announcements will come out? So
that would be true. That would be true. By the way, you can now run Gemini on Omni as well.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I kind of wonder if that means that the Gemini models are actually running on AWS, or if your data queries are happening on AWS, but you're still making callbacks to the Google Cloud Platform to actually do the inference and such. I'd be very curious to know about that architecture. I don't know if they've released details yet. Yeah,
well, Omni theoretically is where essentially, I mean, it's basically Kubernetes. You basically work in the Kubernetes environment.
Yeah.
In the host cloud, and it was an outgrowth of Anthos, where the idea is you could have like a mini sort of Google Cloud in hostile territory. But but there were a lot of calls that were at least as initially was implemented, which went back to the mothership. But that's something which let's follow it up in a few months.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds good. And I what I should mention here, because we're going to be talking about this again on another episode, is that there are a couple of drivers for Omni. One is that people, liked AWS a lot. They had a huge installed base. They liked BigQuery, but they didn't want to switch to Google Cloud. But very similar vein is that data egress costs create data gravity, this concept of data gravity, which means that once your data is on AWS, it's very expensive to move it somewhere else. And so basically they bring BigQuery to the data rather than bringing the data to BigQuery. Now, Amazon does have this kind of exit strategy thing that they offer customers now, where they basically say, okay, if you decide you want to pull out, we'll give you a limited time where we basically make egress costs very cheap. I'll be curious to see if we see more exits using that stragy, but I don't know.
Well, I've always told
happened.
Google, and I've advised them privately, said, guys, why don't to differentiate yourselves, why don't you get rid of egress costs?
Yeah, which Oracle didn't get rid of them, but they discounted them heavily, and that was a factor in the Zoom deal in 2020, and probably in a lot of other deals too.
Yeah, but take a look we'll talk about that in the next episode. Is Oracle's multi-cloud, where basically, which basically zeroes out egress costs if you're working within that cloud.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. So looking forward to digging into that. We could probably talk for 2 days.
Sounds like it. Sounds like that. But we don't want to bore everybody silly.
That's right. Yeah. All right.
Anyway,
any final comments to close things out?
As I said, I was very, I came away, as I said, a little more optimistic about agents in the near term, but still, I think we still need to borrow a lot of disciplines from the software engineering world. Yeah. And so I think we've got some work to do.
Yes. And my other big question, which I brought up on the last episode, is how much is this costing Google? Because the reports we're hearing is that maybe Google has figured out a way to make this cheap. At least at OpenAI, it is very, very expensive to run complex agentic workflows.
Yeah. Well, again, I think, as I said, I don't draw too many conclusions, but I think just the fact that they could train a model off of 8 frames, I think that, I'm not saying that they have now figured it out, but I think that is kind of the key to how we're going to make this affordable, in the near future.
Yeah.
Because I think in the near future, we're going to be seeing a lot of emphasis on time to value.
Yes, time to value. And at some point, AI companies are going to have to start passing their costs on to their customers, or they're going to go bankrupt. So can we do that and still get the performance that we need, the time to value and just the complexity of the streams of tasks and such?
I know a great way to end this podcast. Just answer yes.
All of the above.
Sounds good. See you next week.
Okay, sounds good. See you soon.
Bye-bye.